Okay, I have to be on the right tab. Sorry about that. All right, so first of all, I wanted to show you the site for the keyword approval for your research paper at the end of the course. Let's take a look at the syllabus first. So we're in week 2. Today we're going to cover chapters 2 and 7 in the textbook. There were several supplementary videos for you to check out in Blackboard this week, which were very interesting, and I hope you had a chance to look at those. And you have a discussion board post that is due by Sunday. Just a friendly reminder that I'd like you to post your initial post by Wednesday evening so that your classmates can respond to you. There is a rubric in Blackboard for the discussion board posts. The post should be academic in nature, and you should cite the textbook or other readings to substantiate your opinion. It is an academic discussion, and for an academic discussion, you should back up what you say with theory, theory from the textbook or from some other reading or video or something that you have found. It's great to talk about your personal experience, but as an academic discourse, we want to back that up with what we've read, basically. Then the next assignment that's due this week is the TESOL Quarterly Research Evaluation. I've responded to students' posts with either a 0 or a 1. A 1 means that you're good to go and you can write your research evaluation on the article that you submitted. If you received a 1, you need to find a new article. And I'd like to apologize to a few of you. I had a couple of different dates in Blackboard in different places. So a few people found some older articles that I'd rather not work with. The reason for doing this assignment is, first of all, to expose you to the TESOL Quarterly Journal, which is the preeminent journal in TESOL. So as a master in TESOL, you must know this journal and have read it and should read it regularly. This is where all the cutting edge research in TESOL is published, maybe published in other journals as well, but this is one of the most important ones in our field. And so as you're looking through the more recent TESOL Quarterly special topics for your own research paper. And I'll talk a little bit more about that right now as I show you in Blackboard where you can post your keywords that you would like to propose for your research assignment or your lit review, okay? So let me go to Blackboard and show you where to do that. So if you go to Blackboard and then you go to Tools, and I'm pretty sure that most of you have already found this location because I saw that everybody already signed up for their presentations, so their multimodal presentations. So if you go to Tools and then come to Wikis, where was it? Sorry, down here. So if you come to Wiki and click on that, then you'll see that we've got 2 wikis in this course. One is for the multimodal presentation sign up. And I see that I think almost all the students have already signed up for a weekly presentation. So let me just talk about that real quick. Thank you to everybody for following the format precisely. This is absolutely the first class where that has ever occurred. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's beautiful to see. So you have your name and the chapter that you're going to cover. So today I'm going to make a more formal presentation on the 2 chapters that we were supposed to have read for today. And then kind of moving forward, the Sunday before the week begins, if you could please submit your PowerPoint presentation to us, then we can kind of use that as a baseline for the presentation for the weekly discussion of the chapters. So I think everybody's all set with that, and there's not much more to say there. You don't need to necessarily be present to present, because you'll have audio with your PowerPoint that students can ideally view before coming to class. For those of you who don't already know me, I think most of you do. I've had most of you in class before, but not all of you. I use a flipped classroom methodology, which means that we flip the order of things. So in a traditional class, the students used to just come to class and listen and sit back and be passive and listen to the professor. Whereas in a flipped classroom, students should read and watch videos and prepare themselves to come to the class ready to discuss the content. So it should not be the first time that you see the content. You should be as well familiarized with it as you possibly can without having received direct instruction. And then classroom is an opportunity for us to ask questions, get clarification, discuss, do presentations, go deeper into the theory. And this is the opportunity for what we say is there's 3 steps in learning, and one is to be introduced to the topic. So in flipped classroom methodology, you are introducing yourself to the topic before you come to the physical class meeting, whether it's online or on the ground. And then in the class session, you have the opportunity to develop and master your knowledge of the content. So this is the idea of doing these multimodal presentations, or one of the ideas is to help support this flipped classroom methodology. So you should prepare yourself by having read the chapter, watching your friends, your colleagues and classmates' presentations, watching any supplementary videos that are available inside the Blackboard, as well as participating in the discussion board forums. So that will help you to familiarize yourself with the content as much as possible before you actually start engaging in it. And then we use the class opportunity to engage in the content. I'm sorry, I don't remember if I finished my thought. I was talking about discussion boards in the very beginning, and I was saying that if you could please post your initial response to the discussion question by Wednesday to give your classmates an opportunity to respond to you. So for each and every discussion board, you should make one initial posting. That should be more academic in nature, and therefore to be academic, you should use citations from the readings. And then you should respond to 2 classmates. So your response to the classmate can also include theory, but the main burden of providing quotations or some kind of theory is in your initial post. If you do it in your response, all the better. But I'm not quite as rigorous about the responses. And then you should reflect on what your friend has said. So obviously we want to be friendly and encouraging, but the nice way of promoting a discussion is to respond to it with another question or a point or an experience or an example, or maybe you disagree and you want to propose an opposing point of view. So the idea with the response is to keep the discussion going. So hopefully you will respond more than 2 times. Like that's the bare minimum, is to make 1 initial post and 2 responses. If you feel so inclined to respond more than that, that would be absolutely lovely, because the idea is to have our community of learners in this class where we share ideas and we grow through exchanging ideas and knowledge and information. So that being said, let's go back to tools, because I want to show you how to sign up for the, how to start to send your ideas for your keywords for your lit review. So if you come down here to wikis, that's the other wiki is keyword approval. So click on this one. And then what I would like you to do is to start a thread with your ideas for your keywords. So I've had, I think only one student so far has sent me her keywords by email. I prefer it if you do it here in this forum, because then other students can see the conversation and you can all benefit from the feedback that I provide, because inevitably everybody has similar issues. With the keywords, these are the guiding principles. Number one, of course, it must be relevant to the field of TESOL. Number two, it needs to be new information. So something that's kind of cutting edge. What's happening nowadays in TESOL? And that's the reason that I asked you to do the TESOL journal article reflection assignment in the very first few weeks of class, so that you know how to find the TESOL Quarterly Journal on the PFAL Library database. You start to flip through it to see some of the keywords that some of the published authors in our field are using. What's hot and new and exciting and interesting in TESOL, and what are people researching? Number three, this is the one where people have a lot of trouble, is they'll propose some kind of idea like, I want to research listening and speaking strategies. Woo! There have been books written about that. So you have to think, we've got 10 weeks in which to complete this assignment. A lot of it is scaffolding leading up to the big assignment, to the term paper. So you're not actually diligently working on it the whole 10 weeks, although you kind of are. We're doing a lot of scaffolding to get there. But the point is, you need to complete the whole project by the end of the quarter. So 10 weeks is not a long time. And it's only a 20-page paper. So you can't possibly cover listening and speaking strategies in a 20-page paper. The idea of a lit review is that it would be the theoretical framework of the topic that you want to research yourself if you were going to do a master's project. In general, in the MA TESOL program at Cal State San Bernardino, students do not do a research project. That option is available, and you must meet the criteria and discuss it with Dr. Lin and be accepted for that as a possibility. So if that's something that you're interested in, you need to talk to her about that. But this would be your chapter one if you were to write a research project, or in some places they call it, in some countries it is a thesis, a master's thesis. At Cal State they call it a project. Because generally you don't go out and do much research yourself, although you might. But this would be all of the theoretical background behind the idea that you would like to research. So kind of think of that. And what you're doing in your lit review is you are bringing the reader up to date on everything that has happened in the topic that you have chosen, up to the point of the topic that you would propose to study if you were to conduct research yourself. So you're doing a historical perspective. So you need to kind of gloss over it if it's a large body of research. You can't possibly discuss each and every article in depth, but you want to identify the major trends that occurred with your topic. So this wiki is a location where we can start to dialogue back and forth, because it's a process for new researchers to, and even for people with experience, but it's really good to dialogue and bounce ideas off of people to help narrow the idea down to a manageable scope, and also to something that is new and interesting and would contribute to the field. So if you're talking about listening and speaking strategies, that has been done a million times. The only thing that might make that new and interesting would be if you were to incorporate some type of modern technology. Okay, fine and good. Here's what's happened in teaching, listening, and speaking from the dawn of time until now. But what I would like to look at is the use of podcasts for listening and speaking strategies, for example. So something that makes it modern and interesting. You have to think that you need to appeal to your reader. You want your reader to go, oh, wow, interesting. I'd like to hear what they have to say about that. I want to try that in my classroom. So that's the idea, is to get you to a point where you identify, and I think the word keyword is a little bit misleading because you might have several. So it might even be a little sentence. So this just kind of really helps you to narrow down how you're going to do your research in the PAFAL library database to generate the articles that you need to do your lit review. So if you have, and now you already know because all of you have done the library quiz, and you need to use the Boolean logic for search inside a library database, whichever library it is. But you can use your some keyword or phrase in quotes plus your other keyword, or if it's words, in quotes. And you kind of play with that and use different variations of those words with or without the plus, with or without the ing, kind of playing around with the words a little bit to see what kinds of articles you generate in a library search. So that's going to be a little bit indicative of your keywords, because if you want to use something like reading strategies and you put that in the search field in the library database, you're going to get thousands and thousands of hits, or thousands and thousands of potential articles, which is way too many for you to sift through and find the interesting ones. So if you can narrow down your keywords sufficiently so that you generate a few hundred articles, maybe about 200 to 500 articles. So it's much easier for you to sift through, 200 even more manageable, right? So you want to be restrictive so that it's manageable, but not so restrictive that you get 0 hits as well. So there's a sweet spot in there. And then you have to do your due diligence. And the next step would be skimming through the abstract to see if truly this article is interesting for you or not. And then you discard it. And then these will be the articles that you select to do for your annotated bibliography. So then you're going to choose, I think it's 15 articles off the top of my head. You need to submit 10 to me, but you need to use 15 in your lit review. So you're going to, once we get your keyword squared away, and this is a back and forth process, so you'll post your idea here, and then I'll respond to it, and then we'll go back and forth until we narrow it down. And then once I say approved, then you can go ahead and start to use those keywords as a search in the database to start to generate articles for your topic. And you might find that even though I approve it, when you go out and do the search, either it's still too large or too restrictive, and maybe we need to go back and make another adjustment. So this process takes some time. So I would like you to start posting here, create a thread with your ideas, try and narrow it down. I'll respond. We'll go back and forth until we come up to a mutually satisfying keyword topic, or keywords that you can use for your lit review. So get started on this right away, and please remember to check it frequently so that you can respond if there's a question. So I don't want to have to respond here and send you an email and say, hey, I responded in the wiki, please check the wiki. So if you can just make it part of your daily routine when you're checking your CSUSB emails and checking your courses, please check in on the wiki and see if there's a response to your post. So that being said, we have a few students who have now joined. So I would just like to open the mic for you all if you have any questions on the assignments. Please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you have any questions.
I have a question. This is Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
Hello. So for the keyword approval, I was just listening to what you were saying, but I'm just a little bit confused. So we will be researching these keywords, or as we read, do we come up with those keywords, or like
Say that one more time, make sure I got it.
yes? So for the keywords,
Hey there, I lost your audio.
can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
That's good. So I was asking that for the keywords, for those words.
I lost you again. I think let me see if I can address your question, and if not, maybe you can throw it in the chat box. So you were asking something about, do you post the keyword and you get the keyword as you do your reading? Kind of yes and no. Like you might have an idea that comes up and you can post that here. But if you, I'm going to just stop sharing so I can find the controls here. What was I saying? So you'll refine your idea as you do your reading, certainly. The idea with the readings in from the chapters and in skimming through the TESOL Quarterly is to help you to generate ideas for your keyword. So go ahead and come up with some ideas. Usually it comes from whatever problem you have faced in your classroom, or ideas that you have about your target teaching level, like ideas that you might have or problems that you might have, issues that you might want to address. So it usually comes from some area of interest of yours. If you work with Spanish speaking bilingual students or Korean students, or, you know, it usually comes from your context. And so that usually gives you the personal motivation and interest to deal with that topic. But hopefully the reading will help to spur ideas for your keywords. That's where the new and innovative part comes in, because we all know about the basics, about the reading, the 4 skills and the strategies and pronunciation and things like that. But looking through TESOL Quarterly and hopefully the reading of the textbook for this course will help you come up with some a little bit more peripheral or tangential ideas in the field of TESOL that are not the 4 skills, that are something more modern, a little bit more specific, and more interesting to research. So you might, it might change as we work with this. You might start with one idea, and then based off the feedback I give you, you come up with something totally different. Some people go through 3, 4 totally different ideas until they get set on something. So it's important for us to dialogue and go back and forth and make sure that you're happy and satisfied with your topic, that it's something that you're really interested in reading about. You're going to have to read 15 articles about it. So I hope that you enjoy that topic and you're motivated to learn more about it. Let's see. Did I address your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you so much.
Okay, awesome. I don't know if you, maybe you can adjust the volume on your speaker or something. I can hear you, but it's so faint. You sound really far away.
Let me try.
There, that's better. Great. Anything else, Michelle?
No, I think that was it.
Okay. All right, awesome.
Thank you so much, Dr.
You're
Julie.
welcome. My pleasure. Jennifer and Shannon, any other ideas or questions so far? Are you good?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Me too. I'm okay.
Awesome. Okay, great. All right, so let's then jump into the, let me see if there's anything else I wanted to cover in terms of upcoming assignments or anything like that. I think we're good. Yeah, so actually your keywords should be approved of by next week. So you have until April 20th for it to be finalized. So we've got about 10 days to work back and forth on that and get that.
Okay.
So let's get into the nitty gritty for the for the week, the reading. Did you three have an opportunity to read the 2 chapters for today?
I'm almost done with the first one, Dr. Julie.
Okay.
No, I was actually able to finish the readings for last week, of course, but I just got my textbook over the weekend, so I
Okay.
haven't quite gotten through. I'm about halfway through chapter 2,
Okay.
but I haven't finished chapter 7 yet. So
Okay. All right. Shannon?
I just got my textbook yesterday. I haven't finished the reading yet.
Okay, no worries. Thank you for letting me know. So that's kind of typical in the first couple of weeks. Everybody's still getting their feet on the ground and getting settled, so that's fine. So for those of you that joined at the very beginning, today I was talking about flipped classroom. So ordinarily, I like to kind of shift things, and I don't like to lecture so much, and I like to have kind of like checking for understanding and asking questions and being more of a facilitator and allowing students to ask questions and propose dialogue. But in the first couple of weeks, while people are still getting situated, it's a little better if I just take the lead, and then we'll kind of move into flipping the classroom as we go along. So this one is going to be a little bit lecture dense, and these chapters are a little bit dense too. So we'll go through them collaboratively though, and let's start working our ways through them. So there's some good but a little bit challenging theory in these 2 chapters, I felt. So starting with chapter 2, we're talking about concepts of identity, globalization, and English as an international language. So we talked about EIL a little bit last week, and we'll continue that discussion a little bit today. So now we're starting to get a little bit more into epistemology, which is the science of thinking and theory. So it's kind of a meta look at theory and concepts. So this author is one of the more famous authors in TESOL. He's published a lot. He's very well known, Indian by origin, and well respected in the field. So just looking at the introduction and starting with chapter 2, he talks about 2 interrelated propositions. One talking about global cultural globalization. So we talk a lot about globalization. Everybody knows what that is, and that's kind of like the spread of ideas and maybe making the world a little bit more homogenous, because everybody around the world has more access to different kinds of content that maybe they never could have seen before. So we can travel through watching videos and in time and history and geography, and we can learn a lot about other locations without even traveling there. So this is challenging our traditional notions of identity, because when people had less access to other locations, they had less access to other cultures. Therefore, they tended to question their own identity and their own culture less, because it's all they ever knew. So they didn't ever have anything to compare it to and say, oh, wow, people in that part of the world don't take showers on a daily basis, or they eat with their hands, or they rice is a staple food and I never eat rice, we always eat potatoes, or some of the most basic things in life that we would never stop to question until we're exposed to another situation. So this is what we're talking about, the challenges to somebody's identity. So do I belong to the global culture? Do I belong to my family culture, my school culture, my local city culture, my state, my country? It has various levels of identity formation, which are getting larger and larger with globalization. So the EIL does not exist outside of this idea of globalization, obviously, because we're talking about English as an international language. So we've crossed the borders. And we saw last week when we talked about the inner circle and the outer circles that English used to be the domain of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and the US. And nowadays we have outer lying spheres that are also part of this English language speaker identity, because the language that we speak affects our identity. And that also affects our identity as language learners as well as language educators. So we get into then the theory of modernism versus postmodernism. So modernism comes first, and then postmodernism, as the name implies, comes after. So this author, and I'm sorry I don't want to destroy his name by pronouncing it incorrectly, so he talks about globalism, and we're looking at this new concept in identity formation and challenging the individual's expression of identity. And I'm sure that you're all very familiar with this, because even the word identity politics has become a buzzword nowadays. So the concept of identity has really become quite fluid in the postmodern era. We're even beyond that now, but our traditional concepts of identity are being challenged and changed. And so this is what we call an epistemic break. We're kind of breaking away from the past and changing our ideas and our philosophies about what was right or correct. And it's breaking our boundaries and breaking this inner circle. And then talking about this concept of sameness. So sameness is kind of what gives people a sense of belonging, which contributes to their concept of identity. So identity is usually an individual concept. It's who am I? Who do I think I am? But my concept of self is closely related to my associations. So who I think I am, because we are social beings, is directly related to our social roles. So if you're a mother or a teacher or a daughter or whatever your profession is, these are, like obviously gender and sexual expression and religion, all of these contribute to our concept of self. But you can clearly see how these are also closely connected to our identification with others as well. So then we might get these adjectives who describe who we are. And then this kind of confines us because there are norms as to how we expect each one of these categories to behave. Based on social psychology, humans have a propensity to diminish the number of variables, because if this, we actually have a psychological propensity for creating stereotypes, because we cannot physically possibly attend to all of the variables in our surroundings. So we have stereotypes to help us to learn how to deal with people. So you see somebody coming down the street and you can assess them and say, oh, I think that person looks like a threat because of, whatever clothing they're wearing, or a beard, or, like a hoodie or something like that, that might indicate, oh, that person looks like a threat. Or somebody else, like maybe you see a child with a balloon, and to you that's very innocent. And, so we have these connections that we make so that we know how to interact with people. But they limit us in our concept of self. And we frequently don't even know that until we stop to question our concept of identity, which happens as a result of our interaction with other cultures. So if you're a white American Christian woman and you live in the Midwest of the United States, you have certain prescribed rules for how you're supposed to behave according to the morality of Christianity. And if you don't, you might be shunned by the church, for example. But it can be restrictive on the individual. So people might start to question that and say, okay, just because I'm Christian, that doesn't mean that I can't be gay, or some things that were not traditional in typical Christian thinking. So we're starting to challenge that and think outside of the box of what those delineations of behavior predisposed people to in the past. So difference is something that kind of stands out when you're marking your identity. Sameness helps us to be part of the group. And there's also a lot of psychology about in-group versus out-group, and people feel comfortable with their in-group. And we also have a tendency to criticize those people who are not in our group. So we have a lot of in-group versus out-group dynamics that occur in society. Why? Because we feel safe and comfortable with those that we know, and those that we don't know could potentially pose a threat. So we're just kind of hardwired to think that different could be dangerous. It's a flight or fight, physiological, anthropological development in the human brain. And so here we are, modern people in 2019, and we still have our limbic system that kind of affects the way that we think, and we minimize variables in our surroundings to learn how to react to other people. So being different, obviously you stand out and you become a little bit more of a target because you lose the safety of the herd and the safety of the group. So I already talked a little bit about how your sense of self is determined by the community in which you are involved in the society. And let's get into a little bit more about modernism and postmodernism. So in modernism, this idea originated like between 1650 and ran all the way up until 1950. So that's kind of a long period of time for an idea to be around, right? Or a predominant way of thinking. 300 years, right? So think about what was going on in 1650s. But I'm going to open the mic for you all to have a conversation in a second. So let me just get through this slide, but then I'll go back and I'll ask you what was going on in that period of time in the 1650s and then in the 1950s. So the modern idea of self obviously was not developed way back in the 1600s. And it was more externally imposed. So you can see where the king would tell you what you would do as a part of the fiefdom, or if you were nobility, you had different roles, and that was externally imposed upon you. You didn't have a lot of choice back then. It was decided by your birth and your ethnicity and the village that you were born in. And people did not travel more than 20 kilometers outside of their place of birth in the 1600s. For the most part, of course, we had some explorers who did, and they really broke the mold and brought us to new horizons. So it was a hierarchical system, typically, and there wasn't a lot of room for social mobility. You were pretty much stuck in the class, socioeconomic status that you were born into. You rarely married outside of your group, your socioeconomic status, and even inside the profession, perhaps. That happened in some countries where you would have guilds or professions that would tend to stick together, and they would marry together. So you would have people who were involved in the textile industry, for example, and weaving cloth, and they would tend to stay together, or in animal husbandry. And so they tend to create communities, and they didn't tend to mix and marry outside of their community. So let me open the mic for the three of you to just jump in. And so first of all, if you can tell me, like, what was life like in the 1650s? And then again, what was life like in the 1950s? And then we'll go into this discussion question. What do you know about dominant language learning methodologies during this time period? So it's always important to think about what was going on at that point in time. What was our idea of psychology? How did we think that people learned? And so then therefore, how did we teach language? Because we teach language according to how we think people learn. So three questions. What was going on in 1650? What was going on in 1950? And what were the language methodologies during that period? So go ahead and jump in. Anybody? What was going on in the 1650s? Let me stop my share here. Yeah. Do you know anything about that period? Like, what do you think of? I think of like
I don't know anything about that period, so I feel I don't have anything to contribute right now.
Okay, what about the 1950s? What do you know about that?
Well, in
Michelle, can you turn up your volume?
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know a lot about the 1950s, but I know that maybe during that time,
I'm losing your audio again, dear. You don't feel like you know a lot about that period, the 1950s either?
well, I was just trying to maybe say, that maybe like the class was really important, like an upper class was really important.
Can't hear you well. All right. Michelle, wait, who was the third one? There we go. Jennifer, do you have anything to add? Do you all know anything about the language learning methodologies during that period? Any ideas?
Well, for me, like with the 1600s, what comes to my mind is like kings and queens, and I think more of like England and just different monarchies and how they're very much controlling of the world population. You basically had a class, and it was like the class system, and you stayed within your class. If you were royalty, you were royalty. If you weren't, then you had a very specific role. And so that, of course, is going to play a part in your identity. It's also going to play a part in your language development, because if you're basically, your monarchy, your leadership is telling you, you must stay within these social caste systems, it's going to be very difficult to learn new languages, for any other purposes other than, within your own caste system. So, in my opinion, and then of course, more modern, the 1950s, there was more of a surge towards civil rights movement. There's also, more, right previously to that, or right around the same time period. I'm probably getting some of my decades mixed up in there, but is women's rights, rights to voting, civil rights, things like that. So
yeah, for sure. And that started in like the women's rights and rights for voting started in like the 1920s, but certainly
right.
Civil rights was big in the 1950s. That was huge right then.
Right.
Very good. Awesome. Okay, great. And do any of you know anything about the history of language teaching methodologies? This used to be a typical course we would teach in a TESOL MA, was like the history of language teaching methodologies. But fortunately, we've done away with that course.
Yeah, I would say I haven't really done much research into the history of the learning methodologies, because to me it's more about, I want to be relevant to what are the current methodologies. Although, learning about methodologies does have a place, just so that you can understand the progression in the timeline. But I feel that, for me, I have much more focused on present language learning methodologies, not so much language learning methodologies in the past. But I think pedagogical methodologies, I think of behaviorist and constructivist and some of the psychological, theories were shaping just instruction in general, and then also therefore language learning as well, kind of simultaneously at the same time.
Excellent, very nice, for sure. So the conclusion that we came to, and the reason that we no longer teach that course, is that yes, okay, let's kind of pick and choose. The final conclusion was there is no one best method. We tried a lot of different methods, and in fact found that people are individuals, and there's not one thing that works for everybody. There are different strategies that we can use in different situations for different age level learners, as well as for different needs with English in terms of the goals for learning the language, or for different contexts. And so that's how we came up with the modern pedagogy. So you brought up a couple of good points in that, well, like way back in the past, in this royal era, they used to use a lot of grammar translation method, because languages were generally studied as part of the intelligentsia. So the elite that would study Latin or Greek, because they were studying the classic languages, although they might never speak them, it was part of being an intellectual, or for being able to read the Bible in its original language. And in the 50s, when you mentioned, that's when behaviorism was really strong, started in earlier, like 1930s through the 50s. And as a result of behaviorism, which meant that we used to think that people were kind of like a rat or a pigeon, and that the mind was a black box and you couldn't see inside it. And so therefore all we could do was deal with what we could observe, and we would see stimulus and response. So we say something or do something and we get a certain reaction. So with language teaching, that translated as using audiolingual method. And audiolingual method was characterized by a lot of drills and repetition. So they would repeat the same thing over and over and over, and treat you like a parrot, so that you would be like conditioned to respond perfectly. And it also came up around World War II, which started in the 1940s. And so spies needed to learn the language in order to infiltrate the enemy. And they had to have perfect pronunciation, because otherwise they would be discovered and they would die, they would be killed. So it was absolutely essential that they had absolutely perfect pronunciation. And so that was achieved through lots and lots of repetition. They generally didn't need to know how to write or read so much in the language, some, but speaking was the predominant skill. So that's why they focused a lot on repetition and speaking. So you can see how the times and the era affect the language methodology. Nowadays, there are a few schools that still use that language teaching method, like audiolingual or components of it, because they do believe that it is very effective for teaching pronunciation, and if you want to have good pronunciation, but it is very weak in teaching reading and writing. So it has its pros and cons. So let's talk a little bit about postmodernism then. What does that mean? So in postmodernism, that started after the 1950s then. That was the new era after World War II. And so now, after that point in time, we saw identity as being more as a constructed concept, as opposed to something that you were born into and it was very rigid and had little flexibility. It's not just one identity, maybe you have many identities. It's a little bit more fluid and amorphous, it changes, and it's not the same identity throughout your life either. So when you become, when you graduate, or you become an adult or a parent or a professional, obviously it changes your concept of identity. This is called a bricolage. Bricolage is a collection. And this is characterized by the agency of the individual. So the individual can act and determine their own concept of self. They're not just born into a caste system, they can create their own identity.
Um,
Oh,
Dr. Julie, is the
Yeah.
idea of agency related to the idea? I'm so sorry. Is the idea of agency related to the idea of praxis and like a self-praxis going through that process? Is that related to agency at all?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great connection. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Did you read that in Fairclough?
I did, and then I also remember reading it in there's a lot of that in the Dr. Lynn's multicultural class, the ESL 36, and I remember doing a lot of readings about that. So
Great
it just
connection.
kind of made some good connections, and then some of the things that you were talking about earlier reminded me of some TED Talk videos that we were watching in that class. So just kind of sparking connections in my brain. So I just wanted to make sure that I was correct that the praxis and agency was pretty much interrelated.
Great, great. It's wonderful when you can do that, when you can make interclass and intertextual connections. So it's all part of building your knowledge base. So great work with that. So obviously identity has this historical component as well as the cultural component, a power play. And so the individual does have some ability to influence their identity. So let's do another little discussion question here and see if you can jump in on it. So as teachers, as language teachers or prospective teachers, if you're not teaching yet, what specific professional development strategies will you follow in order to prepare yourselves to A, recognize multiple identities that learners may bring with them, and B, deal with any potential classroom differences that may arise? So basically, how will you deal with getting to know your students' identities? How can you do that? Any ideas?
Well, for me, I teach first grade. And so for me, it's a lot about building a positive climate in my classroom. And so teaching the students how to interact socially and collaborative conversations has, we have a big component with that in my classroom. And just teaching the students how to interact with each other, how to listen to each other, how to take turns. And so, and also therefore it strengthens both their strengths and differences, and it allows the students to appreciate differences that they each have from each other. And so as I was diving into a little bit more work with collaborative conversations, and I was developing that with my classroom this school year, it's really helped me to be able to recognize just different identities that they have, because I have a good majority of English learners in my classroom, most of whom are native Spanish speakers. And then therefore, because we're able to create that climate and that culture of trust and understanding, I'm able to help deal with conflicts that might arise because of that. So I think a lot of that goes to the instructional conversations or collaborative conversations that you either facilitate with your learners, maybe with older learners, and then help the students participate in as well.
Nice. Lovely example. Yeah, it's very important. Without dialogue, without conversation, it's almost impossible to really truly know somebody's identity, because otherwise we stay stuck in the stereotype. But when you get to know individuals as individuals, then you get to know some of these other contexts that help to form their identity. So at first glance, you'll see the child as a L1 Spanish speaker and have certain assumptions about who this child might be. But then as you get to know them as an individual, then you see their uniqueness. And so that's a wonderful way to build community and to help people to understand people's different identities and how complex they are. All right, let's talk a little bit about identity and globalism. So postmodernism is better than modernism at explaining identity because it brings in this broader perspective. It's not as limited. It's based on the times, right? We've become a little bit more evolved with time, and our point of view has become broader because the world has become smaller. So because we're more global, obviously we have a broader perspective. So that's why it's better. So globalism was marked by a near collapsing of space and time and borders. I like that concept. I think that's nice, where it's very, very fluid. It's the boundaries are no longer rigid and prescriptive. And this caused an acceleration in what we call internetization. So it's an information revolution. Like based on the internet, you just see how much in the world has changed. It's absolutely incredible how, for example, now the publishing industry has totally changed. In the past, it was almost impossible to publish as an author, and the major publishing houses had a stranglehold on who could become a famous author and how much they would earn. They would earn pennies for a book, and the publisher would earn the vast majority of the content because they did the work and the promotion and the marketing and the distribution, etc. Well, with Amazon, that has completely changed, and now self-publishing has become incredibly easy, and it's becoming more and more accepted. So nowadays, anybody can get their message out there through a podcast or a Instagram or a Facebook Live. And it's really, really changed the way that we share information in the world, as you all very well know. But I mean, think of pre-internet era and how information was controlled. Culture obviously is shared much more than it ever was before. And in a way that's good, and in a way it's bad, because we have immense language death. Nowadays, everybody is wearing t-shirts and jeans, and people are using their native clothing less and less. So they are losing their identity that was associated with their clan or their village or their ethnic group, and associating more with the global community more and more every day as this internetization takes hold. So people see threats as well as opportunities, of course, from this. There's always two sides of the coin. So there can be good that occurs from it as well as bad. And but it kind of also causes this fragmented tribalization. So now people might be trying to revive their local cultures and identity. Unfortunately, we had to lose many of them to realize the importance and the richness of humanity when we lose cultural identity. So now there's some effort to preserve, for example, with the hula dancers in Hawaii, trying to preserve their craft and their sign language and their language itself and their cultural traditions, as one example of many, many cultures around the world that are trying to retain their identity, not have it be wiped out. So social life under stress, there's a lot of stress, and in the face of threat, people tend to group together. So we saw that a lot in the US after 9/11, and people became very patriotic, and then, you know, when there's a crisis, when there's an attack on your soil or on your people, people tend to join together in a common cause, and they might be overruled by emotion. Let's see, let me jump. We've covered the next one, and let's see, I think we covered that one too. Yeah, so basically you have a lot more freedom, but with that freedom now comes a new opportunity as well as a responsibility for creating a global cultural conscience. So what does that mean in terms of preserving ethnicities, preserving individual identities, preserving languages, yet being able to understand each other? So similar to what you were describing in your classroom, where you have students have collaborative groups that meet and discuss and have this kind of conversation, we need to also promote that at a global level for better understanding. I think I'm going to skip that discussion question because we kind of need to move along a little bit quickly. It's already 7 and I don't know if we're going to be able to get through the next chapter. So identity and the teaching of English as an international language. So this is the point for us as TESOLers. So we were looking at a historical perspective, and fine and good, but what does that mean for us as language teachers? As we mentioned before, it applies to both teachers as well as learners. And obviously we know that language is linked with culture. You just cannot separate it. So you have to take people's identities and cultures into consideration when you're teaching or learning a new language. And English is kind of considered a colonial language from that inner circle with the Brits that kind of spread it around the world initially. And most of those countries in the inner circle are what we call Commonwealth countries because they were former territories of the British Empire. So Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were part of the British Empire. And then many of those countries in the second ring are also former British subjects. So there's some tension around teaching English as a global language because it is kind of seen as a imperialistic language because of the history associated with it. And as we saw last week too, there's a high correlation between military power and the dominant world language. And it wasn't always English, and it probably won't always be. I think English has an advantage because it's a little bit easier than a lot of languages to learn in terms of verb tense and verbal agreement with the pronouns. It's a lot easier than most other languages. And in terms of treatment, we don't have like a formal register and a register for speaking to children. We might in different vocabulary items we use, but it doesn't affect our syntax like it does in many languages. So there's a lot of advantages that English retains as being a global language. And it also has a very strong foothold. So it might be difficult to overturn with a new international language, but not impossible. I mean, another language becomes another country becomes the dominant military power of the world, it's potential that we would need to learn their language to be the international language. So talking a little bit about non-native English speaker teachers' subjectivity. So part of this identity is constructed for them externally. So maybe people who own English language schools or cram schools or English medium schools abroad tend to think that the native speaker model is better. But they're generally not educated in TESOL. They're just going off of the notion that you sound more native-like and that's what your students want to sound like, so that therefore that's better. But they're generally not trained pedagogues, and so they don't understand what's required to be able to teach English as a second language. So it's been very important that these non-native English speaker teachers kind of rock the boat and make us question our concepts of identity for them. So they're helping to negotiate this new concept of idea for the non-native English speaker teacher. So we need a radical reconceptualization of the profession. We need to have one of these epistemic breaks where we break from the past and we start with a new idea. So we want to break away from our colonial past and based on this a central system that, you know, there's different Englishes, there's world Englishes, and what's important is communication and negotiation for communication, not perfect pronunciation. we talked a little bit about this. So an episteme is a set of relations or ideas that unite. So it's a common idea. And this is similar to Kuhn's paradigm shift. So Kuhn is one of the preeminent authors. I think he published in 1920s. I might be wrong on that, it might be 30s, but his book was talking mainly about how we get a paradigm shift. And so a lot of people talk about that as paradigm shift nowadays, and that's where that came from. But he used to say in his book when he published it that it used to take a generation to shift a paradigm. So to completely change an idea about something, a way of looking at something. So it takes a whole generation to basically die and have a new generation that's grown with the new idea in science or sociology for the new idea to really take hold, because otherwise the old school, the old vanguard retains positions of power and imposes the old ideas until enough young new people come along and then the idea is washed away. Well, what do you think has happened to that with the internet? The time span has totally decreased. It doesn't necessarily take 50 or 60 years for us to completely change our concept and come in with a new paradigm. Now the changes are occurring faster and faster because of the dissemination of information. All right, so we talked about this last week about the different circles. This was in the previous chapter, and they talk about it again in this chapter. And but kind of like adding the epistemic idea now to it. So first we just looked at the concept of the fact that there are these three different circles, and now looking at the ideology that is related to these three different circles. So we talk about, like the inner circle has this native speakerism, right? And that's where the publishing houses were. And it's still a major industry is English language teaching, publishing materials. I think, if I'm not mistaken, ELT is a $30 billion a year industry. It's huge around the world. It's a huge industry. So imagine the publishers and their desire to retain a hold on that, which they're losing control of with the spread of the internet and self-publishing and access to content. And there's a movement now for open source materials that are available on the internet that anybody can download and use, and sharing and collaborating with content rather than having to go to a traditional publisher. I'm going to skip that question too. So talking about breaking dependencies on terminologies as well. So in this native speaker episteme, we have several terms or labels that maybe we stick to that help to identify us as part of being this inner circle. But we need to use critical thinking to stop and think about that and check and see what's behind that. Is there a power play? Is there a reason for us continuing to use that same terminology, or us versus them acronyms to define individuals? So it's always good to question and not just accept what it is that we use as common discourse items. So there's all of this freedom, or maybe false sense of freedom, allows people to kind of get caught up in these labels and identity politics as well. So it can be polarizing too. We have extreme opportunity for collaboration, but then there are the trolls on the internet that also cause the divide. So there's always pros and cons to every situation, particularly with human involvement. So do we want to keep language a prisoner? Do we want to keep control over English language teaching? And let's think back on the work of Paulo Freire. Are you familiar with him?
Not really, Dr. Julie.
So he's
I know of his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but I don't know I haven't delved too much into it.
perfect, very nice. Yeah, that is his most famous work. He has several books published, but basically what it shows, and this was that he was a teacher in Brazil in, I also want to say in like the 1930s. And he worked with rural farmers who didn't have a lot of education. A lot of them were illiterate. And he was teaching them to read and write in their L1 in Portuguese. And he wanted to treat them as individuals, as adults, as part of the knowledge culture of farming. So they had tons of information and tons of knowledge, but they were not necessarily well educated in the traditional sense. Maybe they didn't know how to read and write, but they knew the seasons and when it was going to rain and when to harvest and when to plant and what was companion planting to reduce pests and how to safeguard your harvest from rodents, etc. So tons and tons of information that us city folks and us modern people would not have. So his pedagogy of the oppressed is all about honoring people, and particularly adults, for the experience that they bring to the classroom. And so he's really the father of the idea that teachers should be facilitators, that we're not the God of all knowledge, that frequently our students know way more than we do about certain topics, maybe not about ELT, but surely about something else. Everybody's traveled to somewhere I've never been, or worked at something I've never done, or had some experience that they can bring to the classroom that we can share and learn from each other. So just like we don't want to keep people prisoners, we don't want to keep language a prisoner either. We want to respect language and people for what they bring to the table to make the conversation richer and deeper. So therefore, we need to change the terms that we use. We need to change the consecrated terms that we use for knowledge production and attack the episteme at the root. And so kind of be disruptive and shake things up. So how do we do that? Initially, there's a fundamental reconceptualization of research. Traditionally, research started with an ethnographic approach. That means studying a certain culture in depth. Margaret Mead was one of the very first ethnographers, and she used to study the Trobriand Islanders in the Pacific. And she was one of the very first ethnographers who lived with this tribe and recorded everything about their life. So this is one kind of research. And she kind of became part of their community and participated in their ceremonies and their rites and rituals. But she was a great observer, and she would write down everything that she observed. But that kind of locks in these power and identity situations from an external observer's point of view, which might not be a entirely authentic representation as it would be from somebody from inside the culture. So there are considerations that we need to take in, or things that we need to take into consideration with our approach to research. Some ideas from second language acquisition. For those of you who have done the 660, you should all know about interlanguage, fossilization, acculturation, communicative competence, intercultural competence. Those are all really important ideas in SLA, but they're very closely related to the native speaker episteme. So how do we break this root of basing everything on the native speaker, when nowadays the majority of people speaking English in the world are not native speakers of the language? So we're having a power shift here where we're changing the power and the focus. So there haven't been a ton of studies on multilingual and multicultural contexts. Nowadays, it's becoming more important, and people are focusing more on multicultural competence and the competence of the second language user. There's been a lot of focus on what we call translanguaging, which is negotiation between two different non-native speakers of English and how their communication styles differ from when you have a dialogue between a native speaker and a non-native speaker. When you have a native speaker and a non-native speaker, the native speaker has a leg up and they tend to dominate in the conversation and assume that the non-native speaker needs to modify their communication in order to meet the native speaker. So the burden is upon the non-native speaker to make himself or herself clear to the native speaker. And in translanguaging, when you're looking at two non-native speakers, it's a completely different dynamic where there's much more negotiation for mutual understanding. No one person is the right one, and they don't focus on necessarily having absolutely perfect grammar or pronunciation, but what's most important is communication and understanding. So it's been a very interesting shift. So some of the periphery country scholars are now becoming much more active and engaged in research. They're publishing more. The inner circle doesn't have such a stronghold on the publishing world as it used to. And so we need to have proactive research from these people to produce part of the body of knowledge of TESOL from these different multicultural perspectives and contexts, come up with a different alternative model that we can use because when you have one epistem that goes out, something inevitably comes in its place. And so we want to replace it with something that's more bi or multicultural. So how do we go about breaking the methods that were used by basing itself on this inner circle, on the center? The methods that we talked about a while ago were all generated by the native speakers. They created the methods. So nowadays, maybe people in the outer circles can start to propose methods. How did they teach language in their context? It's a different point of view from these countries because they have different needs, they have different resources available, and maybe have different cultural heritage that makes things appropriate or inappropriate, and they have different strategies for their context. So we're coming into even a more fragmented way of looking at ELT as opposed to one prescribed method. We're finding different techniques and strategies that can be used all over the world. So we want to promote the non-native speaker language competence. In the past, we always focused everything on native speaker competence as if that were the best. But as we were talking a minute ago about the negotiation for communication and understanding, which is what it's actually all about. So shifting that focus from perfection to performance. So the idealized concept doesn't really match reality. Obviously, it never does. Reality is always very different. Let's see how we're doing here for time. We've only got 10 minutes left, and we still have a couple of slides. So let's see if we can do that, and then we'll go back to a discussion question. Where is it? Did I lose my place? Yes. Okay, here we are. So one concept that I brought up in the previous slide was the concept of acculturation. So acculturation is, the term itself tends to have a bit of a negative connotation. People tend to think that acculturation means giving up your sense of identity in order to fit into a new culture, which is not necessarily the case. It's more of a conscious decision to assume qualities as part of your identity and take them on when you learn about them through your interactions with a new culture. it doesn't mean that you have to give up your native culture identity. You can if you choose to do so, but you shouldn't be required to do so. So it's a choice, and it's a conscious choice based on the variables that you have been exposed to in a new culture. Cultural assimilation certainly has a negative connotation. So that does mean that you give up your native culture identity to join the other group and become part of that group. So you're subsuming or suppressing your natural tendencies or identity in order to assimilate. And we don't want to put people into that position, obviously. But you can see how that happened a lot, like even up until very recently, where Mexican immigrants to the US, their parents would frequently not allow them to speak English at home and really want their children to become mainstreamed and part of the culture. And that was the predominant philosophy in the schools in the US too, was to mainstream them. And so now we've finally learned that it's important to acknowledge people's heritage language and how that actually contributes to their richness as a human and their cognitive abilities as well. So the world uses English for communication, not for cultural identity. We're using it as a tool so that the world can be a smaller place so that people can communicate with each other. You do assume part of the identity when you take on another language, but that's not the priority. The priority is English for communication. We talked about that one a little bit before about protecting linguistic cultural identities. And so there's been a shift from a bicultural look to an intercultural. So there's more give and take, more back and forth. It's not easily separated and classified. There's more of a flow that classifies this new epistem. So we need to be aware of these rules. What are the pragmatic rules for the L2 community? Do you know what that means? What are pragmatic rules?
I don't know.
Anybody else? So pragmatics is the study of how we speak. It's the maybe the tone and the register and the words and the intonation that we use according to the situation we're in. So even as native speakers of any language, we adjust those features of a language in our communication to have a better desired outcome. So if we're speaking to a judge, we're going to use a more formal register. We're going to be a bit more submissive, much more polite, ask for permission. So there are certain structures. We'll use more modal verbs, for example, rather than being assertive and imposing with our intonation. So these are examples of pragmatic. So it's making these choices, and we need to help our students to be aware of how those changes occur when they're using the language, depending on the community with whom they are speaking. And then the last concept is a shift from cultural literacy to cultural liberty. So instead of just knowing about other cultures and having read and studying them and learning about them, but we want to then springboard onto an idea of freedom as a result of knowing about all of these different cultures and ways of thinking about the world, then we can consciously choose our own identities. And this is a sense of liberty. So the textbook industry, we've talked a little bit about this and how that's changing, and open educational resources, OERs, are becoming much more available. it's very interesting if you stop and look at some of the textbooks you use, and sometimes we don't even stop to think about it, but you really have to analyze whose values they are espousing. I'll never forget when I was very first started teaching English, and I was teaching English to somebody in the Southern Hemisphere, and I was trying to teach the 4 seasons, spring, summer, winter, fall, and we had the little pictures of the snow and the leaves turning brown and falling and the flowers growing. And he couldn't get it and just couldn't get it. And I couldn't understand. Like, well, of course, guy, you know, fall, winter, spring, what do you mean you don't understand? I'm translating for him and everything. And after about a half an hour discussion, I understood that where he is from, they didn't have 4 seasons. They had 2. They had wet and dry. There was no winter. There was no, you know, spring. And so I felt so silly. Here I was trying to teach him and thinking he was not intelligent. And that wasn't the situation at all. It was a completely Western biased textbook. But something as basic as that, we don't stop to question until we get out of our own culture to be able to understand. I may have never have thought of that if I hadn't had that experience or that interaction. So you need to be really careful with the textbooks you use and at least teach students critical thinking. Like, let's look at this. Why is this female in this job as opposed to a male? Or why did they use this pronoun or this term or this picture? And it's very good to teach students critical thinking and how to pick apart these things so that we don't just imbibe these stereotypes that are given to us, sometimes unconsciously, but sometimes with a purpose. So global textbooks are coming out now that are trying to incorporate these different perspectives and points of view. We're trying to be more open-armed about this, more to embrace different cultures and points of views. So it's nice to use locally prepared content that address the needs of the local individuals. So let's wrap up here with this last question. How can you involve students in selecting raw materials for you to use in designing instructional materials that appeal to them? Because you might be stuck with a textbook. Maybe your school prescribes that you use a certain textbook, and maybe you find that it's culturally biased or Western biased. How can you get your students involved in helping you to find materials that will bring in different perspectives?
Sometimes I'll use something like something from a local newspaper or local periodical, you know, something that's from that area so that I can use that in the classroom and it'll be something they're more familiar with.
Okay, great. Any other ideas?
One thing that comes to mind for me, and of course, again, I'm coming from the very young learner perspective, but just do interest surveys. You know, what are you interested in? What is it that you want to learn? You know, and how does that influence you? Because of course, as we know, motivation is key for language learning. And so just asking them, you know, what it is that they want to learn, and where they want to grow their knowledge. So, you know, interest surveys and things like that.
Lovely. Michelle, do you have an idea?
Well, I feel that maybe, for example, if for those learners, because I know that through the observation that I have done, motivation for like English language learners at a high school level, it's I have found it like really challenging. So sometimes, you know, when I try to ask them or approach to them and say, okay, what are your interests? What type of literature do you like to read and things like that? They're like unsure about it. So I don't know, maybe like what I found interesting is that, for example, in the observations that I'm conducting for the fieldwork class, we have like a lot of the majority of students are from Hispanic population, and then we just have one student from Syria. And I don't know, a way that I think that it will be interesting, to address or to incorporate, the different cultures in the classroom. What about if, maybe a PowerPoint presentation presenting, I don't know, like the culture of the student. Um, I don't really have like a lot of experience with that, Dr. Julie. I just think maybe, learning from each culture, maybe that can be interesting to them because, for example, if someone doesn't know about the culture from Syria, and when the student presents something from Syria, they can expand their knowledge about that country. Or that student who is from Syria, if he or she doesn't know a lot about, Mexico or Central America, they can also expand their knowledge about that specific country. So maybe that can be something interesting and where they learn from different cultures.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great ideas. Yeah, it's lovely to get students to collaborate and to share what a better resource. You already have it in your classrooms, the interest surveys and getting students to present. Those are great ideas. Okay, so what are some impediments for progress? What could happen? Well, we might marginalize people. We might have them pushed off to the side. People might marginalize themselves. And it might occur that the native speaker legitimacy episteme actually gets more embedded around the world. It's a possible reaction formation to this movement. So we need to have a global change in consciousness. And I believe that we're going in that direction where people are becoming much more tolerant and open-minded and more experienced with different cultures. We hope. There are examples of people who are going to the negative side of it as well, but we have to be agents of change and try and encourage ourselves as role models as well as our students of how to be more tolerant and change these perspectives. So in conclusion, basically we need to break away from this institutionalization of the colonial heritage, as well as the institutionalization of native speakerism and the publishing industry, and embrace new ways of constructing knowledge, and then have these new knowledge systems become sustainable systems that are local to are sensitive to the local context. So I think that we're on a good path, that we have to be vigilant and always check our own language and our own presuppositions, and make sure that we're constantly challenging ourselves so that we're examples of this mentality that we would like to spread. So unfortunately in the time, I just wanted to do these Zoom sessions like for an hour and a half just to check in with people and give us an opportunity to interact and ask questions and to provide some verbal and visual clarification on assignments and questions. So I'll post this PowerPoint and you can look at the summary for chapter 7, and then please do let me know if you have any other questions about assignments. If anything comes up during the week, just send me an email and we'll be in touch. Do you have anything else before we close?
I think I'm fine, Dr. Julie.
Okay.
No, I don't. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For the TESOL article review, I mean, I can just choose anything at all and just relate it to qualitative or quantitative studies and write about it?
Pretty much. The only restriction really is based on the date. I want you to choose a more modern article. And so I apologized at the very beginning of the Zoom session that there were 2 different dates posted in Blackboard. So some students posted an older article. I would like it to be a newer one, because this will help you to start thinking about topics to use for your keywords for your lit review. So pretty much anything. It's basically just to get you to start looking at the TESOL Quarterly Journal and to start kind of analyzing research and how that then will produce an article based on the research. So you need to start to look at the lit review in the article. So if you choose a study and you're just kind of doing an examination, like, okay, here's an article, here's how it's set up, here's the lit review, start to notice that and understand that, and then be prepared to write one yourself.
Is that supposed to be in an essay, more of an essay format, or should I follow the example on Blackboard of the assignment where it was not quite an essay format and just more, you know, kind of laid out sequentially?
Good question. So it's better if you follow the format that's on Blackboard. There are some guidelines. Did you see where I went? If you go to lit rubrics and lit review?
Yes.
And then, yeah, so if you go here to the TESOL Quarterly Research Evaluation rubric, and then let me just read that and open it, and then we can walk through that real quick. So these are the different components that are required on that. So first of all, the relevance of the article. You just state, you know, so there's different sections in the review. So you would state why it's relevant to your teaching or why it's interesting for you. And then you give the correct citation in APA format of how to cite the article. So that's a quick, easy 10 points. And then you're going to critique the content itself. So you're going to look at the author's research question. It may not be obvious. They might not say, here is my research question, colon, and put it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So sometimes you kind of need to tease it out. But you need to try and make it clear in your write-up to the best of your understanding. And then you're going to very concisely summarize their summary. So in their article, their first section will be a lit review, and you're going to summarize their lit review. So a lit review is a summary of what has happened in the field. And so you're just going to point out the major points that this author identified. That can be done in like essay format. You can just describe it that according to so-and-so in year blah, 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 they said that XYZ, but then according to this other author in year P, he said blah, blah, blah. So you can do that in like paragraph format. And another paragraph where you identify the theoretical perspective. What background are they taking? Are they using a multicultural approach? Are they, what kind of study is it? And they'll tell you very clearly in there. Oh, that's a little bit more in the research format. Sorry, going back to theoretical perspective. The theoretical perspective, you might need to tease out a little bit. They might not come out and say, oh, I'm a cognitivist or I'm a behaviorist. They might not say that, but based on the way they write and the research that they summarize, you can draw that conclusion. So once again, in an academic discourse, you substantiate your position with what you found in the article. So you might not know, but you might say, I think that this author's research perspective is cognitivist because he cited so-and-so, who I know is also a cognitivist, and he said that XYZ. So you just want to support your idea. And if you support it sufficiently, you know, your idea should be logical and it should be fine. So then another section of your paper would be a critique of the research format. So first of all, just describe it. What is the research format? How did they conduct it? And in the article, there should be a very clear section where they describe their research. So you're just going to summarize and synthesize that content. And so just explain, oh, it was an ethnographic study. It was a double-blind controlled research design. They'll tell you exactly what the design was, and you can summarize it. Please don't copy and paste. If you do, use quotations and cite, but you should synthesize and say this information. You should paraphrase it and put it in your own words to the best of your ability. And so just explaining how the data informs the research question, they should explain that too in their study. You might need to draw conclusions. These all would be like essay paragraph format. So maybe one paragraph on each of these bullet points. And then a critique of the results. So What conclusions, and they'll tell you very clearly. There will be a summary and results section in the article where they talk about their conclusions. So what did they learn from the study? What was the takeaway? And then were there any principles extracted? Maybe there weren't. That one is kind of up to interpretation, but based on the conclusions, were they able to formulate new theory or say that there was a principle or idea that they got from this research that might be applied towards teaching, for example? And what has been learned, which is very similar to the conclusion. So I think the critique of results could just be one paragraph. All 3 bullet points you could put into one paragraph. That would be sufficient. And then the last part is just kind of formatting, basically. So is what you wrote coherent with the article itself? Remember, you're submitting a copy of the article to me, so I have the article that I can compare with what you wrote. And did you write well and using academic language, APA format? Did you check for spelling, etc.? And did you do the citations correctly using APA, etc.? Is that helpful?
Yes, extraordinarily helpful. Thank you.
Awesome, my pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how just walking through it orally makes all the difference, doesn't it? Reading it and looking at bullet points and they're summarized, and it's just sometimes hard to know exactly what we want, isn't it? So I'm glad we had this opportunity to go over this together, and thank you for your questions and thank you for showing up, and I really appreciate your participation, and I look forward to seeing your keyword postings during the week.
Okay, Dr. Julie.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you, you too. Bye.
Bye, thank you.